cold morning mist hung low over the jagged cliffs of Pointe du Hoc on June 6, 1944, creating an eerie silence that would soon be shattered by one of the most audacious military operations in history. German soldiers positioned atop those 100-foot granite walls had every tactical advantage imaginably: elevated firing positions, reinforced concrete bunkers, pre-sighted artillery coordinates, and a seemingly impregnable natural fortress that had withstood centuries of Atlantic storms. They had been told by their commanders that no force could scale those cliffs under fire, that the position was unassailable, that they were safe. They were catastrophically wrong. What they hadn't accounted for was the arrival of the U.S. Army Rangers, a breed of soldiers so fundamentally different from conventional infantry that the very sight of their approach would send ripples of dread through even the most battle-hardened Wehrmacht veterans. These weren't ordinary troops following standard operational procedures. These were men who had volunteered for the most dangerous missions, who had endured training so brutal that more than half their original candidates washed out, who operated under a simple but terrifying philosophy. The impossible mission is just the starting point. The genesis of German fear toward the Rangers didn't begin with D-Day, though that operation certainly cemented their reputation in blood and legend. It started months earlier in North Africa and Italy, where Ranger battalions had conducted raids so swift and devastating that German intelligence officers struggled to classify what kind of unit they were facing. Standard Wehrmacht doctrine had categories for every Allied formation. Regular infantry moved at predictable speeds. Armored divisions required specific counterattack. Airborne units had identifiable deployment patterns. But the Rangers defied categorization. They struck from unexpected directions at impossible hours, moved through terrain deemed impassable, and displayed a level of individual initiative that contradicted everything German military theory understood about American soldiers. One Gestapo report from Tunisia captured after the war described them as T-hood commanders who seemed to materialize from nowhere, accomplish objectives that should have required battalion-strength forces with just a handful of men, and vanish before reinforcements could arrive. The report's author noted with barely concealed anxiety that these soldiers didn't fight like Americans were supposed to fight. They fought like highly motivated partisans who had somehow acquired military-grade training and equipment. What made this fear particularly acute was that they violated German assumptions about American military culture. Nazi propaganda had spent years depicting Americans as soft, undisciplined, and reliant on material superiority rather than warrior spirit. The Rangers shattered this comfortable narrative completely. German soldiers who survived encounters with Ranger units consistently reported the same disturbing observations. These Americans moved through darkness with uncanny confidence, maintained absolute noise discipline during approach, demonstrated expert marksmanship even under extreme stress, and most unsettling of all, it seemed genuinely eager to close to night fighting distance rather than relying on artillery and air support like other American units. A Wehrmacht officer's diary recovered near Monte Cassino contained a chilling entry after his position was overrun by the 1st Ranger Battalion. They came up the mountain in complete darkness, through terrain we thought impassable. No preliminary bombardment, no flares, no shouting, just silent forms that were suddenly among us with knives and grenades. Half my men were dead before we fully understood we were under attack. These are not the Americans we were told about. These are something else entirely. The psychological dimension of this fear extended beyond individual encounters too. Strategic concerns at the highest levels of German command. By mid-1944, Wehrmacht intelligence had identified Rangers as priority targets whose presence indicated imminent major operations. The simple appearance of Ranger units in a sector triggered German defensive preparations that would normally be reserved for full division assaults. This wasn't paranoia, it was learned experience. Rangers had proven they could accomplish strategic objectives that conventional forces required overwhelming numbers to achieve. When German commanders learned that Ranger battalions were part of the Normandy invasion force, it confirmed their worst fears about Allied intentions. They knew these weren't troops being sent for standard beach assaults. Rangers were surgical instruments used for specific, critical missions. The question that haunted German defensive planning was simple but terrifying. What objective is so important that the Allies are sending their best soldiers to accomplish it? The answer, when it came in the form of Rangers scaling Pointe du Hoc under withering fire to neutralize coastal batteries, validated every fear German intelligence that had developed about these extraordinary soldiers, who seemed to view impossible not as a limitation but as a personal challenge to overcome. The transformation of ordinary American soldiers into Rangers was itself a source of deep unease among German intelligence analysts who studied Allied training methods. Unlike Wehrmacht elite units that were often selected based on political loyalty or Aryan racial criteria, the Rangers drew from an entirely different philosophy that the Germans found both puzzling and threatening. Any American soldier could volunteer for Ranger training regardless of background, ethnicity, or social class. The only requirements were physical fitness, mental toughness, and a willingness to endure what became known as the most punishing military training program in the American arsenal. German officers who had been educated in the rigid Prussian military tradition couldn't comprehend how such a democratic selection process could produce elite warriors, yet the battlefield results spoke for themselves with undeniable clarity. The training regimen developed by Lieutenant Colonel William Darby and refined at camps across Britain and the United States broke men down to their fundamental core and rebuilt to them into something that transcended conventional infantry. Trainees endured forced marches of 30 miles with full combat loads, conducted live-fire exercises where machine gun rounds deliberately passed inches over their crawling bodies, practiced cliff scaling and small boat operations in conditions that would have justified canceling normal training, and received instruction in hand-to-hand combat techniques that emphasized lethal efficiency over sporting fairness. What truly distinguished Ranger training, however, wasn't the physical brutality. The Wehrmacht had its own harsh training protocols, but rather the emphasis on individual decision-making and tactical flexibility that ran counter to German military doctrine. Rangers were taught to think like officers, to assess situations independently, to improvise solutions when plans collapsed, and to take initiative without waiting for orders from higher command. This was revolutionary in an era when most armies, especially the rigidly hierarchical German military, relied on soldiers following precise instructions from their superiors. A captured German training manual from 1943 specifically warned officers about this American tendency toward undisciplined initiative and recommended maintaining strict formation integrity to counter it. But the Rangers had taken this American trait and weaponized it into a tactical philosophy, where every soldier was capable of assuming command if necessary. In practice, this meant that killing Ranger officers and NCOs didn't decapitate the unit the way it would disable a German formation. It simply meant other Rangers stepped up to continue the mission. A Waffen-SS officer who survived the Cisterna disaster, where 2 Ranger battalions were surrounded and nearly destroyed, later wrote in his memoirs about the profound confusion his men experienced when Rangers continued executing coordinated attacks even after losing their command structure. "We eliminated their leaders in the first hour," he wrote, "but they kept fighting as if nothing had changed. Every man seemed to know exactly what to do, as if they shared one mind distributed across many bodies." The physical conditioning of Rangers also contributed to German apprehension in ways that transcended simple combat effectiveness. Wehrmacht soldiers in 1944 were increasingly exhausted, undernourished, and worn down by years of war on multiple fronts. Many German units defending Normandy contained teenagers, overage reserve, or troops recovering from wounds suffered on the Eastern Front. The Rangers they faced were young men in peak physical condition who had trained relentlessly for this specific mission. The contrast was sometimes devastating to German morale. One prisoner captured near Omaha Beach told his interrogators about watching Rangers scale the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc and feeling a sickening certainty that Germany had already lost the war. "They climbed 100-foot cliffs under fire," he said, his voice hollow with defeat. "We shot at them, dropped grenades on them, cut their ropes, and they kept coming. They climbed with 70 pounds of equipment while we could barely march 10 kilometers with ours." How do you fight men like that? How do you defeat soldiers who won't acknowledge defeat? This psychological dimension, the sense that Rangers were simply incapable of giving up, may have been their most potent weapon. German defensive doctrine relied heavily on breaking enemy morale through casualties and hardship, forcing attackers to withdraw or surrender. But Rangers had been conditioned to view casualties as inevitable rather than breaking points, to interpret wounds as temporary inconveniences rather than excuses to stop fighting. Perhaps most disturbing to German soldiers was the Rangers' apparent enthusiasm for close-quarters combat, a preference that violated the expected American pattern of using firepower to avoid direct confrontation. Most U.S. Army doctrine emphasized calling in artillery, airstrikes, or tank support rather than closing to bayonet range. Rangers deliberately sought out the intimate violence of knife fighting, room clearing, and hand-to-hand grappling. They trained extensively with the Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife, a weapon designed specifically for silent killing, and practiced close-quarters pistol techniques that emphasized speed over precision. This preference for getting up close and personal created a specific kind of terror among German defenders who suddenly found themselves fighting not at comfortable rifle range but in trenches and bunkers where every shadow might conceal a Ranger with a knife. A Wehrmacht corporal who survived a Ranger trench raid in Italy described the experience as fundamentally different from conventional combat. "When artillery hits, you take cover and wait for it to end. When tanks approach, you have anti-tank procedures. But when these Rangers came into our trenches at midnight, there were no procedures. It was just chaos and darkness and the feeling of hands grabbing you from behind. 3 men in my section were killed without a single shot being fired, just the sound of struggling and then silence. That kind of fighting gets inside your head. You stop sleeping properly. You become terrified of the dark." This calculated cultivation of psychological terror, combined with genuine tactical competence, created a multiplier effect where the mere rumor of Rangers being in an area could degrade German combat effectiveness before actual contact even occurred. Intelligence reports began circulating through Wehrmacht units describing Rangers as something between elite soldiers and supernatural threats, capable of appearing anywhere, anytime, seemingly immune to the attrition that wore down normal formations. By 1944, German commanders understood a brutal mathematical reality. A single Ranger battalion posed a disproportionate threat that required defensive resources normally allocated against much larger conventional forces, creating a strategic problem with no satisfactory solution. The actual combat encounters between Rangers and German forces created a body of battlefield legends that spread through ranks with the virulence of a psychological contagion, each story more unsettling than the last. At Dieppe in August 1942, 50 Rangers participated in the disastrous Canadian raid as observers and combatants, and even in that catastrophic defeat, German after-action reports noted with reluctant admiration that the American contingent fought with fanatical determination and were among the last Allied soldiers extracted from the beaches. But it was in North Africa where the Ranger mystique truly crystallized into something approaching myth. During Operation Torch, Derby's 1st Ranger Battalion conducted a nighttime forced march of 12 miles across rugged Algerian terrain to capture the coastal batteries at Arzou before the main invasion force arrived. The German allied Vichy French defenders, confident in their prepared positions, suddenly found themselves under assault from directions they hadn't fortified because the approach was considered too difficult for infantry to traverse in darkness. The battle lasted less than an hour. The Rangers captured the entire battery complex with minimal casualties, killed or captured every defender, and secured the positions before dawn. When Wehrmacht intelligence officers later reviewed the operation, they recognized a disturbing pattern. The Rangers had succeeded, precisely because they had done what conventional military wisdom deemed impossible, making the impassable approach their avenue of attack. The Italian campaign elevated Ranger operations from impressive to legendary through a series of actions that seemed ripped from adventure novels rather than sober military history. At the Battle of Sens Station in Tunisia, 3 Ranger battalions conducted a coordinated night attack across open desert against entrenched Italian positions supported by German armor. The attack plan called for a 12-mile approach march in complete darkness across terrain with no cover, followed by a direct assault on prepared defensive positions, exactly the kind of operation that military textbooks classified as suicidal. The Rangers completed the march with such precision that they achieved complete tactical surprise, overran the Italian positions in brutal close quarters fighting, destroyed enemy equipment, and withdrew before German reinforcements could arrive. One Italian officer who was captured during the raid and later interviewed by German intelligence provided an account that circulated widely among Wehrmacht units. They moved across the desert like ghosts. We heard nothing until they were in our trenches. My men are soldiers, trained soldiers with years of service, but these Americans fought like demons. They didn't hesitate, didn't take cover, just kept coming forward no matter how many we shot. I saw one of them take a bullet in the shoulder and he didn't even slow down. He just killed the man who shot him with a knife and kept moving. What kind of training creates soldiers like that? The Cisterna operation in January 1944, despite ending in tactical defeat for the Rangers, paradoxically enhanced their fearsome reputation among German forces because of how they fought when surrounded and outnumbered. The 1st and 3rd Ranger battalions, along with the 4th Ranger Battalion, attempted to infiltrate behind German lines near Anzio, to cut Highway 7 and disrupt enemy reinforcements. The mission went catastrophically wrong when they walked into positions held by the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, one of the most formidable German units in Italy. What should have been a quick annihilation of isolated American light infantry instead turned into a day-long battle where outnumbered and surrounded Rangers inflicted casualties far beyond what their situation should have allowed. German reports from the engagement expressed genuine shock at Ranger tenacity, even when ammunition ran low, even when wounded, even when surrender would have been the rational choice. Rangers continued fighting from every building, every ditch, every shell crater. A German tank commander, who participated in the battle, later wrote that his crew destroyed a farmhouse where Rangers had taken position, only to have survivors emerge from the rubble and immediately engage his infantry support with small arms fire. We had to kill them, he wrote with something approaching respect tinged with horror. They would not stop fighting. They would not surrender even when clearly defeated. I have fought Russians on the Eastern Front who fought with desperation born of fear of capture, but these Americans fought differently, not from fear but from some kind of conviction that surrender was simply not an option they would consider. The capstone of Ranger legend, the event that German veterans would discuss in hushed tones for decades afterward, was the assault on Pointe du Hoc during the Normandy invasion. The mission parameters alone seemed like a cruel joke. Scale 100-foot vertical cliffs under direct enemy fire, neutralize a battery of German 155mm guns that could destroy the entire invasion fleet, and hold the position against inevitable counterattacks until relief arrived. Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder's 2nd Ranger Battalion executed this impossible mission with a combination of courage, innovation, and sheer bloody-minded determination that entered military folklore. German defenders atop the cliffs had every advantage. They looked straight down on the approaching Rangers. They had stockpiled grenades and ammunition for exactly this scenario. They could cut the scaling ropes as fast as the Americans attached them. Yet the Rangers kept coming. When Germans cut one rope, Rangers climbed another. When machine gun fire swept a section of cliff, Rangers found another route. When casualties mounted, the survivors didn't retreat to the landing craft, they climbed faster. A German soldier who defended Point du Hoc and was captured later that day told his interrogators something that perfectly encapsulated why the Rangers inspired such dread. "I shot 3 of them myself. I know I hit them because I saw them fall. But within minutes, more appeared to take their places, climbing the same ropes. It was like fighting the ocean tide. You could kill them individually, but you couldn't stop them collectively. When they reached the top, when they came over that cliff edge with their faces covered in blood and mud, still carrying their weapons, still attacking, that was when I knew we would lose. Not just lose this position, but lose everything. Because how do you defeat an army of men like that?" The aftermath of Point du Hoc created perhaps the most enduring element of Ranger mythology among German forces. The 2nd Battalion, having scaled the cliffs and captured the position, discovered the heavy guns had been moved inland. Without hesitation, Rangers pushed further into enemy territory, located the relocated artillery, destroyed it with thermite grenades, and then fought off German counterattacks for 2 full days while isolated and running low on ammunition. Of the 225 Rangers who began the assault, only 90 were still combat effective when relief finally arrived. What they had held, they had completed their mission despite casualties approaching 60%. German officers studying the battle afterward recognized a terrifying truth. Ranger units didn't calculate acceptable loss ratios or consider tactical withdrawal when casualties mounted. They simply continued mission execution until either the objective was achieved or every last man was dead or incapacitated. This wasn't recklessness, their careful planning and tactical skill proved that, but rather a fundamental philosophical, the commitment that rendered them nearly impossible to stop through conventional defensive measures. A Wehrmacht major who helped coordinate the counterattacks at Point du Hoc later wrote in his diary an observation that captured the essence of why Rangers haunted German military thinking. "We are taught that every unit has a breaking point, a level of casualties or hardship beyond which it ceases to function as a coherent force. The Americans at the point had no such limitation. They broke every rule we know about combat effectiveness, yet remained effective. This is not a tactical problem we can solve with better weapons or defensive positions. This is a crisis of the human spirit. They have more of it than we do. And in war, that may be the only advantage that truly matters." The long-term psychological impact of facing Rangers extended far beyond individual battles to fundamentally reshape how German military leadership assessed the entire Allied threat in ways that influenced strategic decision-making at the highest levels. By late 1944, captured German documents revealed that Wehrmacht intelligence had developed specific protocols for identifying and tracking Ranger units, with orders to immediately report any Ranger presence to Corps-level command. This wasn't standard procedure for conventional American divisions, but Rangers had proven themselves capable of disrupting operations far beyond their actual numerical strength. The German High Command understood that where Rangers appeared, something significant was about to happen. Either a critical objective needed capturing, a breakthrough was being attempted, or a deception operation was underway to mask larger movements. This created a persistent strategic dilemma for German planners: allocate disproportionate resources to counter potential Ranger operations and risk weakening other sectors, or accept that Rangers might accomplish strategic objectives before conventional responses could be organized. Either choice represented a victory for Allied planners, who had effectively created a force so threatening that its mere existence degraded German operational flexibility across entire theater fronts. The stories that German soldiers told each other about Rangers during quiet moments in bunkers and foxholes took on qualities that transcended simple military respect and entered the realm of superstitious dread. These weren't the exaggerated tales of invincibility that propaganda created. They were whispered accounts from survivors who had actually faced Rangers and lived to process the trauma. A particularly widespread story concerned a Ranger sergeant at Point du Hoc who had been shot through the leg during the cliff assault, fashioned a tourniquet from his own belt and continued fighting for 6 hours before accepting medical evacuation, during which time he personally killed 11 German soldiers and held a critical position against multiple counterattacks. Whether this specific account was accurate in all details mattered less than what it represented: a fundamentally different breed of soldier who operated by different rules, who didn't stop when normal men would stop, who seemed to draw on reserves of determination that defied conventional understanding of human limits. A Luftwaffe pilot who had been shot down and spent time in a POW camp with captured Rangers reported to his debriefers that even in captivity, these Americans maintained an unsettling intensity. They exercised constantly, practiced hand-to-hand combat techniques on each other, and spoke openly about escaping and returning to their units. He said, Regular American prisoners were relieved to be out of combat, grateful to have survived. The Rangers seemed angry about being captured, as if being taken prisoner was a personal failure rather than the fortune of war. They made the guards nervous because everyone could sense they were looking for any opportunity to escape and continue fighting. The final months of the war in Europe saw Rangers deployed in operations that cemented their reputation as the Allied unit German forces least wanted to encounter. During the Battle of the Bulge, Ranger battalions were rushed to critical positions to blunt German penetration, and their performance under desperate circumstances reinforced every fear Wehrmacht veterans had developed about their capabilities. At places like Hill 400 near Bergstein, Rangers held against overwhelming odds in fighting so savage that even hardened Waffen-SS officers expressed shock at the intensity. The 2nd Ranger Battalion seized Hill 400 in a frontal assault up steep, exposed slopes against entrenched German positions, an attack that by all conventional military calculations should have been repulsed with massive American casualties. Instead, Rangers reached the summit, cleared the German defenders in vicious close-quarters combat, and then held the position against 8 separate counterattacks over a 40-hour period. German forces threw everything available at the hill artillery barrages that turned the summit into a moonscape. Infantry assaults by fresh troops, even armor support when the terrain allowed it. The Rangers, many wounded, running low on ammunition, and fighting in brutal winter conditions, refused to yield a single yard of ground. A German regimental commander whose unit participated in the counterattacks filed a report that bordered on despairing. The Americans on Hill 400 cannot be dislodged by conventional assault. They have turned the position into a killing ground and seem willing to die to the last man rather than withdraw. Each attack we launch loses cohesion within minutes as men realize they are attacking Rangers and morale collapses. I request either massive artillery preparation before the next assault or permission to bypass this position entirely, as current tactics are simply feeding our soldiers into a meat grinder with no prospect of success. The strategic significance of Ranger operations ultimately lay not just in the objectives they captured or the casualties they inflicted, but in the disproportionate share of German attention, resources, and psychological energy they consumed. Wehrmacht intelligence staff spent countless hours trying to develop effective countermeasures against Ranger tactics, time that couldn't be spent on other planning requirements. German defensive positions had to be reinforced and garrisoned more heavily in sectors where Rangers might operate, which meant those troops weren't available elsewhere. Most significantly, the knowledge that Rangers were part of the Allied order of battle created a persistent background anxiety among German soldiers at all levels. Knowing awareness that at any moment, the elite American troops who specialized in impossible missions might appear in your sector, and when they did, conventional defensive measures might prove inadequate. This psychological attrition was cumulative and insidious, degrading German combat effectiveness in ways that didn't appear in casualty reports but were nonetheless real and significant. A German major captured in April 1945, during the final collapse, provided perhaps the most telling assessment of the Ranger impact during his interrogation. He had fought on both the Eastern and Western fronts, survived Stalingrad, and witnessed the full catastrophic arc of Germany's defeat. When asked what Allied unit he had feared most, his answer was immediate and unequivocal: the Rangers, without question. The Russians would overwhelm you with numbers and accept terrible casualties, which was frightening in its way. The British were professional and methodical, which you could respect and plan against. But the Rangers were something different entirely. They combined American industrial capacity with an almost Germanic emphasis on excellence and training, then added something uniquely American: this belief that individual will and determination could overcome any obstacle. We had no doctrine for fighting soldiers who genuinely believed they couldn't lose, who treated impossible missions as personal challenges to overcome. You could kill them, but you couldn't defeat them psychologically, and in the end, that made all the difference. The legacy of German fear toward the Rangers extended well beyond the war's end into the post-war period, influencing how military professionals worldwide thought about elite infantry formations. German officers who wrote memoirs or participated in military history projects consistently identified Rangers as representing a fundamental evolution in warfare, the creation of soldiers who combined physical excellence, tactical proficiency, and psychological resilience in ways that traditional military structures couldn't replicate or effectively counter. The Ranger ethos of mission accomplishment, regardless of cost, of embracing the most dangerous assignments, of viewing impossible as merely difficult, had proven itself in the crucible of combat against what was 1944, still one of the most professional militaries in the world. That German soldiers, men who had conquered most of Europe, who had fought across continents, who prided themselves on military excellence, consistently identified Rangers as uniquely threatening, validated the American experiment in creating elite infantry through democratic selection and brutal training rather than aristocratic tradition or political ideology. The fear Rangers inspired wasn't born from propaganda or mythology, but from repeated battlefield encounters where they had demonstrated capabilities that transcended what German military theory believed possible for ordinary soldiers elevated through training alone. In the end, perhaps the greatest testament to Ranger effectiveness was the simplest. When German veterans gathered after the war to discuss their experiences, when they spoke of the units that had haunted their nightmares and commanded their unwilling respect, the conversation inevitably turned to those American soldiers who had climbed impossible cliffs, held untenable positions, and accomplished missions that should have ended in failure. The Rangers who had transformed fear from an abstract concept into a tangible battlefield reality that no amount of training or fortification could entirely dispel.